Welcome to all of you joining. We'll be starting the webinar in just a few minutes. Thanks very much.
Super cool. Do we know if Lucy's joining us as well?
Okay, hi everyone. So welcome to the Financial Health Benchmark webinar with Twine. My name's Lucy and I'm going to be helping to host the webinar today from Power to Change. And I'm also joined by Jake Moffat and Edward Walden, who are also from Power to Change. And we're going to be going through the presentation, and Edward's going to be doing quite an active demonstration today. So we'll be taking questions throughout. I can see that people are joining every second at the moment, so I'll just wait for people for that to slow down, and then we'll carry on and get going. Okay, so I'll just leave it 2 minutes, and then we'll get going right from the start. Okay, so I can see that it's starting to slow down, people joining. We've got a great number of people online today, so that's brilliant. Thanks so much everyone for joining us. Someone's just asked if they can only see Edward's face. Yes, that's correct. He's going to be presenting most of that today, and with myself and Jake just helping to host. So the webinar today is Learn More About Your Financial Health with Twine Benchmark. And then that's going to be hosted by me and presented by Jake Moffat, who's the product manager at Power to Change, and Edward Walden, who's the digital transformation officer. So for those of you who are familiar with the Power to Change webinars, we do ask that any questions, if you could put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. And that just means that they're recorded for future reference. It also means if we don't get a chance to go through all the questions today, then we can get back to you at a later date by email. So it just means that they're all recorded and we can see. Also, because we're all sharing our screen, it's easier to see the Q&A function rather than the chat box. So if you could just put them in there, that would be great. I'll remind you throughout if people forget. A bit different to the normal webinars, because Edward's going to be doing a really active demonstration, actually showing you the Twine Benchmark product. I'm going to be keeping an eye on the questions, and any that are relevant to what he's showing on the screen, I'll just ask, and then we will have a time at the end for question and answers as well. So I will be trying to keep up with you and ask questions throughout if they're relevant to that particular section. Okay, so if we can move the screen on, Edward, please. Thanks. So I'm just going to say a little bit very briefly about Power to Change. I'm sure you're all familiar if you're here today. Next slide, please, Ed. Okay, so Power to Change is a charitable trust. We were started in 2015 with an endowment from the National Lottery, and we are set up to help community businesses across England. So just to go through, a community business are locally rooted, community-led, and trade for community benefit and make people's lives better for people who live in those communities. So for further information about Power to Change and what we do, and also our response to the COVID crisis at the moment, please do visit the Power to Change website, which is powertochange.org.uk. You will also be able to find this website on, this webinar on that website after today's recording. We'll also be sending out the recording to all participants afterwards. So I'm now going to hand over to Jake, who's the product manager for Twine Benchmark, and he's going to introduce the webinar in full and then hand over to Edward. So thanks, Jake.
Thanks very much, Lucy. And thanks very much all of you for joining us this afternoon. So I'm just going to do a bit of a brief introduction to what Twine Benchmark is and why we've put it together. And then Edward's going to go into a much more detailed demonstration, as I think you'll really see this kind of the benefits and some of the possibilities of the tool much better from something a little bit more hands-on. So what is Twine Benchmark? It's a financial planning and assessment tool designed specifically for community business, with the hope that we can uncover greater insights and greater detailed insights for community businesses about their finances, and also help community businesses start to bring in more financial data and more data-driven decision-making into their business planning activities. So we worked with our colleagues over at MyCake to develop a completely unique data set compiled from, as it says on the screen, more than 650 community businesses over a 5-year period, and we're adding data every year to that. So it's a really deep and rich data set that we're drawing from and that we're pulling insights and information from. We designed the product alongside actual community businesses, members of our trade up scheme and some of our other programs, to make sure that it's as aligned to the working practices of real community businesses as possible. And we're keen to keep that sort of collaborative design approach. And the other thing we've been able to do is really make use of Power to Change's experience in assessing grant applications. One of the things that we think Twine Benchmark can be really useful for is understanding a bit more about the financial details that you put into grant applications and funding applications, so that there's more strength, more power to those applications, and hopefully as a result, more successful applications. So just before I hand over to Edward to really show you the tools, I think it's, as I say, much easier to see what it is rather than just have me describe it. I think there are three main things that Twine Benchmark can really do for community businesses. The first is understand more about your financial health and the financial health of the sector. The second is to help you discover new opportunities. Where is there funding available that businesses like yours are accessing that you aren't? Where are there trading opportunities and greater expansions available to you that you might not have thought of? And finally, it's a great way to identify your vulnerabilities. One of the things that our researchers, Power to Change, has shown us is that some financial vulnerabilities can creep up on community businesses. And one of the things that this tool is useful for is highlighting areas that you might want to consider looking into, areas where perhaps you're more vulnerable than you thought. And particularly at this time with the COVID-19 crisis, getting on the front foot around sort of safe financial planning is something that we're really keen to assist community businesses in doing. And we hope this can be a step towards that. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Edward to show you the product in full. Thank you, Edward.
Super cool. Thank you very much. Lovely introduction from two people. Nice bonus. Right. I need to change my screen share for you first off. Hopefully that will have worked for everybody else. So, as Jake said, this is Twine Benchmark. It's currently available in a public beta. So rather than having to remember this long URL here, you can simply go to twinetogether.com, which is our sort of parent website for all the things we're doing. Product is slap bang in the middle. Twine Benchmark is there, and that takes you through to a brief page with blurb, and then you'd click that button and you'd be brought straight here. So don't need to worry too much about the long one. If you know twinetogether.com, then you'll be able to find it nice and easily. So as Lucy said, she'll be handling questions and comments. So if you feel like you would like more clarity about anything I'm going through, please, by all means, type a question. She'll voice it to me and we'll halt and go over it. Because obviously this is quite detailed. It's definitely a lot better to be addressing questions as they arise, rather than moving on through sort of 2 or 3 screens that look completely different and then expecting us to backtrack a bit. Okay, super cool. So Twine Benchmark, obviously available for public. This is what you land on. So this is the sector overview screen. It's made up of 2 main elements. The first one is the data screen, which is this element here. Let's see if I can do my spotlight. No, where's it gone? That one, there we go, super cool. So you should be able to see my cursor a bit easier now. So this main area is obviously sort of the body of the data. It clearly indicates that it's 2017. So as Jake mentioned, as well, time goes on, we'll be uploading more recent data to it. And we'll also be expanding the number of businesses that we have available on the data set. So currently, we're looking at the overall data in this section here of 657 community businesses, which is the full data set, that's everyone, of all of these different business types across all of England. So we can filter this data down, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute, but it's worth looking at the overall data first. So there's two sort of elements to this, which is, this is just sort of sector overview. This is all of the data, and you can drill it down, but then putting your own data into it is the assessor and applicant section that we will look at shortly. Let's see if I can get rid of the URL bar. There we go. Excellent. That looks a bit better. Oh, no, I still need my spotlight back. And I can move that. There we go. Forgive me. My head's taking up the wrong place of my screen for me. There we go. So, yes, it shows initially overall income, costs, and asset and liability data for everyone that we currently have in the data set. So for the total income, it has a little pop-up that gives us some data about how percentiles work, what the shaded line means, and all that kind of stuff. So people who are very unfamiliar with this type of financial analysis are able to look and roughly understand what this shows, which for us is the 90th percentile are above this line, the middle 50% are with the fat shaded line, and the average of everyone in the data group is the dark blue line. And then we can also see these metrics in bar chart form, and also the first of our gearing ratios. So the average total income of all these community businesses, 212,000, and you can see the rough breakdown. So we can see of all of these 657 community businesses, most of them have, there is a high average even of commercial and trading, grant-related activity, donations are much smaller, and other income is much smaller still, which of course is exactly the way we want the data to be borne out, in that we can, we have to include other income as the catch-all for anything that's not included, but ideally it would be very low, because that helps indicate that actually these are a very good breakdown, because most of the income does fall under them. We can click expand on this, and then we can see a further breakdown of all of that income data based upon those subheadings. So we can click through and we can see for commercial and trading income breakdown, we've got averages, the 25th, the 75th percentile, and a number of businesses that's data, whose data feeds in to this specific metric. So we can say of the 657 businesses we're looking at the moment, 163 of them have retail and catering income, 144 of them have services and contracts income, and so forth. So this sort of helps you gain a bit of a slice about what the community businesses overall are doing that we have data for as a national effort. And the same is true of grants and donations. So we've got some interesting learning points here to pull out. While the data set of 657 is quite large, it's not as though any of our users will be mapping against this data, because it's such a broad subset. You're never going to think, well, we need to be the average of all of these people. You'd break it down, which we can do in a moment. But it's interesting to see that actually of all of these organisations, 181 report receiving funding from private trusts and foundations, 121 from local authorities, and 94 from lottery funding. But then it's also interesting to note that the average grant for those, the lottery funding of the average lottery funding that is received is higher than either local authority or private trusts and foundations. So those are the interesting kind of visualized data points that you can start to look at and say, well, actually, maybe not so many community businesses are aware that lottery funding is quite substantially higher than local authority funding, and that a good secondary option to lottery funding, if you can't acquire it, would be to maybe engage private trusts and foundations. Because if you look at this kind of data, almost twice as many community businesses are funded by private trusts and foundations compared to lottery funding. So interesting sort of pointers towards different sources of potential money. Obviously, when you do the applicant stroke assessor one, you'll be able to look at your own values against a particular cohort, and we'll show you that in a minute. So anyway, we can see donations as well, see that there's 3 organisations that report crowdfunding at the moment, which is quite a small slice. But then we also have financial ratios. So as I said, the trading ratio is the first one that it offers you. And this is designed to help better understand some of the overall activity that these community businesses are undertaking. So if you click the question mark again, it tells you how that she says, it tells you, there we go. It tells you what that trading ratio is comprised of so that you can actually see and work it out for yourself. And this is true of all of the ratios we will subsequently show you. So it means that if you've got somebody, again, who isn't necessarily familiar with financial gearing ratios, it will not only tell you what they are. So for example, what does 0.63 mean? It tells you how they're worked out so that somebody can click on that and understand, well, 0.63 means essentially 63% of the income, the group average even, of the income of these businesses is made by commercial trading activity, whereas the remaining 37%, maths on live stream, is made up of grants and donations and other things that don't qualify as commercial trading. But then we can also see the percentile data for this group as well. So the 25th percentile is only 27%, the 75th percentile is 91%. And so because then basically the lower 25% are below 27%, but the higher 75% are above 91, we can tell that there's actually quite a high predisposition towards high levels of trading, because basically these people are only 9% off completely trading income, whereas these people are still quite substantially, or at least proportionately, reliant on grants and non-commercial income. Anyway, so we can then scroll down and look at costs. There we go. So again, shows you the overall data, and with the bar chart, salary, other costs, direct and building costs. And of course, again, our data set is quite large, so this will vary massively. So organizations that just rent a shop space will have far lower building costs potentially than organizations that are a heritage trust and trying to maintain older buildings. So we can again break it down later. But for the overall data set, we can see all of these different types of expenses, which is quite extensive. Quite a detailed breakdown of all of these different organizations' costs. And the final one is assets and liabilities. So here we can see quite positively, I just need to expand that. There we go. Here we can see actually quite reassuringly across all of the community businesses that we have in our data set, the average assets are 175,000 and the average liabilities are just about 31,000, which is an incredibly positive thing to find out about. And we can break these down into fixed assets and current assets, and then we have some more of our financial ratios again with a fuller understanding. So that's roughly how to interpret this. In practice, you're almost certainly not going to want to look at all of these businesses, because if you're running a community cafe, there's no point sort of comparing yourself to an art center. It just, you know, it doesn't work so well. The models are so radically different. So what we can do is we can select different sectors, as many as we want, from this drop down. And then we can also select region. So let's say we want to look at community, let's do community space, hubs or centers. And this is quite a large group. There's quite a lot of these registered compared to, for example, community cafes. 189, great. So now we're only looking at organizations which report that they're community spaces, hubs or centers. Always want to do that in the wrong order. And now the total income and all of this data is that much more valuable because we know we're looking at organizations with a particular type of format. So we can see the average total income, the trading ratio has changed, obviously because it's based upon the data set. And we can see that actually amongst community centers, I'm just going to shorten that to community centers, most of them still have a substantial amount of grant income. And we've got the pie chart that shows us the same. So now if we look through this data, there's a bit more value to it. Rather than being sort of a bulk overall view, we can be looking at specific blueprints of retail and catering within the community center data set. How many of them have retail and catering as an income stream? How many of them have services and contracts? How many have space and asset hire? And so,
Edward, sorry to interrupt. I've got a question from Jennifer Sansom.
Yep.
Community business financial models will have been skewed by COVID-19. Can Twine help us understand the different effects on different sectors of C19? Or is it more to provide a working example for a healthy economy scenario?
Yes, so it's a mixture of both. So our data set is a 2017 data set. So if you're comparing yourself to this data set, or you're using this data set for learning, then you absolutely will be comparing yourself to a healthy situation scenario. I can't remember what you just said. But when it comes to using the applicant and assessor functions, which I will be moving on to, then that's more about putting your current live data into it. And you can even use that for projections. So if you put your current data into it and then you reduce the income by a further 20%, it will be able to tell you, well, actually your debt to asset ratio might change, your net current asset ratio might change, and that's where the learning takes place. So it's a bit of a mixture. You can use it in both ways depending upon which element you're looking at, but it's also valuable to know that this is the sort of the data set that exists for comparison. In a few years, we will have the COVID-19 financial data set, and we will be able to say, we were to sort of look at that comparison. But yeah, it's broken down in those two ways. The data set is old data, but the actual analysis that we can do with the applicant function is live, and all of the gearing ratios it gives you is very much based upon your current situation. I don't know if Jake might want to add anything to that, but if not, I'm just going to roll on.
I was going to say, if I might add just one thing to that is, although we can't show the sectoral analysis of how COVID-19 is affecting particular sectors, although other elements of Power to Change are working on that, putting out that kind of analysis at the moment. What this can help to do is, if you have been heavily affected, for example, trading opportunities massively curtailed, or issues with meeting sort of costs, what this can show you is possible opportunities where you may not have identified opportunities for certain different kinds of trading, or perhaps areas where you might be able to replace certain levels of trading with new areas, and how they've been successful in businesses similar to your own. So although it won't give you a sort of a live readout of what's happening at the moment, it can still show you where community businesses that run on a similar model to yours have been successful in either running at a much lower cost than perhaps you're running at, and how they manage that, or equally areas sort of ample for trading that you may not have yet been able to exploit. So in that sense, we hope it has quite a relevant implication for the current situation.
Yeah, super cool. Hope that answers the question. But that's also a good prompt for us to stop looking at the overall data set and move straight into the applicant section, which is sort of definitely the more meaty and the more practical element to it. We'll just quickly go down this data set again. Very briefly, it's worth mentioning that the number of businesses, these don't add up. So very obviously 47, 37, 84, 70 and 92 don't add up to 145, because of course there is some overlap. Some of these businesses report multiple income streams. So there's no particular way to know whether, for example, the 75th percentile organization that reporting retail and catering is also the same one that reports this, because they're all generated on averages. There's no way to sort of determine that, but don't look for them to add up. Cool. So then again, we've got the trading ratio, all of the costs and all of the assets and liabilities. So this is a bit more useful again, because it helps show things like assets aren't likely to massively change during the coronavirus lockdown. For things like community centres that own a building, the likelihood is that they're going to try to weather the current situation without liquidating their assets if they can avoid it, because as soon as the lockdown ends, they're going to be wanting to leverage their asset into more income as fast as they possibly can to try to remain solvent. So some of this historical data is definitely useful. It helps you map what the average type of asset is, and lets you see the differences between their overall assets and liabilities. Cool. Right, I need to move a menu widget to do the next bit. There we go. So the next one is the applicant and assessor side of it. So this is where you just start to feed in your own data. So in this instance, I've got some prepared data that I'm going to put into it. There we go. So if we're still looking at community centre, we can go through this with regards to that. So let's have a look.
Hi, Edward. I've just got a question from Kate. It
Yep.
says, where it states percentage grant versus trading income, is that percentage total grant or just that number of community hubs have some grant income as opposed to being their majority of income?
Let me have a look. So, percentage grant income, where were we looking? Was that was this, I think. I hope that's what we're referring to. This is about, it's not about what percentage of organizations get grant income, it's about what percentage of the average income of every business in the data set is a grant, and what percentage of the average trading average income is trading. I think that makes sense. I might have hand-fisted that. So it's about average numbers. It's not about, do you get a grant, yes or no? What percent said yes? It's about the average total value of those grants compared to the average total value of commercial and trading.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much.
Cool. It's really weird not being able to see chat, but thank you very much. Right. Okay, cool. Where were we? Applicant and assessor. Excellent. Super cool. So this is where you start putting your own personal data in, and I need to grab some data for this one. So we're using the data from a slightly fictionalized community hub in this one. So this is data from 2017 for a community hub, services and contracts. So if you go through this yourself, as you put your data into it, you can either fill out this for grants, or you can click enable details, and then it will let you break down what those grants are made up of. So essentially, if you're doing it really quickly, or you don't have access to fine-tuned data, you would say, look, I get £9,000 in grants, for example. Whereas if you do have access to this, you could say, well, I get £2,000 of that 9 from private trusts and foundations, and then I get the other 7 from local authorities or something like that. So this is what lets you have more detail for the financial analysis at the end. I'm going to get rid of those because actually our community hub doesn't have any of that income. What they've given us is just that so far. So then we're going to expand expenditure. Expenditure, forgive me. And they report spending £5,000 on national insurance contributions, £120,000 on staff salaries. Then they report having 53,000 in other costs. Click. Yep, perfect. 53,000 in other costs, £1,200 in rent and rates. And then we go on to their assets and their liabilities, which is the final section. And they listed having £1,000 in fixed assets, £5,000 in current assets, and £24,000 in current liabilities. So that is how you'd fill this out. Ideally, of course, as I mentioned, you want as much detail as possible because you're going to be able to compare the organisation much more fully if you've got the actual breakdown of all of these different metrics. Because this is in a beta, we are very, very interested in getting feedback. So if you're a community business, or maybe you're involved in the grant making process somewhere and you're looking at this and you're thinking, well, a really obvious missing section under grants, for example, would be X. By all means, get in touch with us and say, we think actually predominantly it should be included, and we can look at doing that. The breakdowns that we've used were based upon our research and obviously our own activity as a grant funder, but we're very happy to be wrong and we're very happy to add extra detail if it serves people. So then you fill out income, expenditure, and assets and liabilities in as much detail as you possibly can, and then you click analyze. So now it's going to be, I need to move my face again, there we go. So now we've got the output report. So here it's informing us that our input summary was 137,000 total income, 179 total expenditure, and our net assets are minus 18,000. So at a glance, that's not great, could be a lot better. But then we can also compare this data to our comparative group. So here it lets us know that the sector that we've used is the community space, hub or center, and we've got all regions. So the yellow bar is our personal data, and the purple bar is the comparator group. So we can see at a glance our income is lower, our costs are very similar, but our balance is dramatically lower than the average that other organisations in England that comprise 189 community hubs, centres or spaces. So you can still access all of the data filters during this process, and you can also access the input form. So I can go back now and I could say, well, actually my current liabilities aren't 24,000, they're 28,000. So this is live. It doesn't generate this as a one-off, which is why you can go back and you can play around and change sort of modeling based upon, well, if we were able to set up some form of service delivery or contract delivery that would bring in an extra 20,000, what are our metrics looking like then? And the same is also true of the sector filter on the left and the area filter on the left. So if you're looking at this and you think, well, that's useful, but we're based in the Midlands, so actually we'd like to see just the data for the Midlands, you can click filter data and it updates the report now explicitly based upon those organisations. So
Edward, I'm sorry, we've got just a question on that. It's how do you fill in the information if you have multiple functions as a community business, i.e. you have a community space and a retail space, for example?
Yeah, so interestingly, community businesses are a really good example of that, in that almost all of them have multiple different revenue streams. So one of the really surprising things we found was just how substantial retail and catering as a function was within the community centre area. So I'd say there's two different ways of doing that. You could do it once for each of the businesses if you really want to, if you wanted to think of them as sort of siloed activities that are undergoing and you'd like to model them as almost quasi-independent ventures, but you could also just roll them all into one. Because this data is pulled primarily from a data set created by Power to Change, we haven't sat down and said to these organizations, look, we know you've got a cafe, but do you really want to sort of list it as your part of your community centre? Would you like to separate them out? We've just bundled all the data together. So you're welcome to use it more than once, you know, to sort of separate those things out. And if you've got staff that specifically work in a retail or a catering venture, and then staff who work on service delivery, it would seem very appropriate to do so. I've previously worked for charities that maintain sort of retail spaces, but also then do things like social prescribing contracts for local councils, and they are very different ventures. So looking at one and then the other and maybe then bundled together would be most useful to you. Looks like we might have another question as well. Maybe.
Yes, we do. Sorry, I think that answered the first one. Thanks so much. And the next one was the income, expenditure, and asset figures are for a year. So if the balance figure is simply income minus expenditure, then the balance won't show the actual financial picture, will it?
Yes.
You need to capture the balance brought forward into the year as well. That's from Kevin.
Yeah. If I've understood that question correctly, I think current assets should include balances brought forwards into the current financial picture, at least in terms of cash or easily liquidatable investments, if you've got any. So yes, just looking at what is our income minus our expenditure won't necessarily tell you everything, but the output report does have more detail on it. I need to scroll down. I haven't quite got that far because of all the questions, but it does start to show things, particularly these calculated metrics, which are the financial gearing ratios we looked at.
Yeah, so that's answered the question. Thanks, Edward.
Yeah, they were hiding slightly down there. Yes, so things like the net current assets ratio and the net fixed assets ratio are a perfect example, hopefully, of what you're talking about, because there are questions of cash flow beyond just, you know, we got 100,000, we spent 80,000, that can be answered by these specific ratios, which is why they're useful. If you're completely unfamiliar with them, again, we've got a nice little box here that will come up if I click it and then don't move the mouse, that tells you how these are all worked out. So if you really wanted to, if you didn't understand any of these metrics, it will not only tell you what our math was, but it will tell you why they're useful. So for example, for the net fixed assets ratio, it says a figure below one is indicative of operational efficiency and long-term solvency, while a figure above one may suggest that there's some inefficiency in the business's finances. So it gives you a very brief view of these as well. We're expecting that most grant applicants or grant assessors will probably have a bit more of a grasp of these, but there's always a first step for everybody. I'm getting to grips with why they're valuable and how they're useful myself, and it makes a great deal of sense. They're very useful. So these not only give you your value, they give you the group average. So now, because of the filters I just showed you on the left, we compared to the 25 community businesses of a similar nature, community centre, in a similar area. So now what we're doing is we're looking at very, very small scale groups of being able to say, actually, compared to other local people, what are we doing? We can see our debt to asset ratio is massive. It's huge. We're the 100. So we are literally the highest debt to asset ratio in this group. And as I mentioned, this is based upon a real community businesses data, which is a little worrying. And you can see the wide difference between current assets ratio. It's very low. Resilience ratio, again, is very low. And the trading ratio is sort of middling. Not really middling. It's not great, but I think you'd worry a great deal more about the other ones than the trading ratio. So then as we scroll further down, we also have input breakdowns. So this breaks it out into income, costs, and assets and liabilities, and it also has a color coding scheme. So we can see very basically, let me scroll up a bit, commercial and trading, our value is 137,000, the group average is 120, so we're actually slightly above the group average of the other 25 organisations that are theoretically in our area. Our input percentile is 63rd, which, yeah, that is right, 63rd, which is above the midpoint, so that's great. The 25th percentile and the 75th percentile, useful, you know, they show we're sitting reasonably well. Then if we look at retail and catering, we can see that our value is lower than the average. So we're not doing as much retail and catering as other community centres in this area are. But for services and contracts, we're actually earning a fair deal more than other community centres are. So this comes down to, if you're an applicant, understanding your own business. If you're an assessor, understanding that business. Because you might look at this and think, well, they're not doing a lot of retail income. Why is that? The answer is probably because their business model is focused more on services and contracts, which is perfectly fine. There will be businesses which have the reverse of this. So it's not so much about immediately finding fault. It's about understanding where you sit compared to peers. And we have a color coding scheme as well that shows outliers. So essentially, we are the on this percentile for income, we're 50th, but our space and asset hire is 18th. So it's more than 20 percentiles away from our average, which suggests that our space and asset hire is considerably lower than organizations of a similar size within this data set. So again, this is sort of where it comes down to be a balance between looking at peacetime data, you could call it, compared to a current situation. But realistically, you can also be saying, well, our space and asset hire is really a lot lower than it could be. Can we look at a way to increase that? Because other organizations in our area and in our business, with our business model, are finding more success and more income from undertaking space and asset hire. It looks like we might have another question.
We do. Can you search on a specific community business?
No. So this was put together very specifically to use averages and overall data because we didn't particularly want people to be able to drill down to specific businesses using this. What I will say is that all of the data that we hold, I think, Jake, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe all of the data that we have in this data set is actually publicly available through either the Charities Commission or Companies House. So if you really, really wanted to compare yourself to a specific business that you know about, you could go to either the Companies House or the Charities Commission and get their data for these things and put it into the tool, generate a report, and then generate your own report for direct comparison. But the idea is that the average of a larger group will provide more telling and more useful data than a specific single business to look at. It's worth mentioning also, a question that kind of comes up from that one is, putting your data into this is not adding your data to the data set. So just because you've used this input form doesn't mean you get added to this. You in fact are, because there's no account created, your data is forgotten as soon as you refresh this page or if you leave it for half an hour. So you can feed as much data into this as you want. It's not saving it, it's not doing anything like that. And it also means you can put completely hypothetical values into it and say, well, look, if we got really, really lucky and doubled our trading income somehow, what would we look like then? It's not going to benchmark future users against that or anything like that.
Another question. Yeah, that answered that one perfectly. Thank you. Is there a way a community business can get more of the narrative behind the quantitative data and ratios in terms of developing further opportunities?
That's very interesting. So that is part of our intention with this, because we've essentially released this earlier than we meant to, which is why it's a public beta. But we think that the value that it shows in providing these ratios to organizations that might not otherwise have such easy hands-on comparative data is really valuable, considering the current coronavirus sort of crisis and lockdown. Absolutely, we have had talks about implementing those kind of, well, if this shows this, then it means that you could consider X, Y, Z. And exactly what you're saying about the narrative to help lead people, because it's easy to look at all of these numbers and look at all of these ratios and go, okay, they're kind of only useful if you can really tie them into a direct, straightforward impact. So one of the ones that we mentioned earlier was, if you are comparing yourself, so let's scroll down and do commercial and trading and say like space and asset hire. So that's quite low. Maybe we should look at increasing it compared to other organizations in our area. Do we have any community businesses who also are community centers close to us that are friends with us that we could say, how do you do so well on space and asset hire? Because we've just found out that we're a bit lower, and how do you maximize that? So yes, absolutely, we're looking at doing that. We're also, the Twine team is also looking at developing digital service design consultancy support for community businesses. We're sort of finalizing how to do that and sort of how to present it and make sure that we offer it appropriately. But part of that would absolutely comprise looking at what can you do based upon not only sort of the metrics that you've got, but also the narrative of your individual organization, how you serve your community, what kind of services you already deliver, how can they be grown in a way that can hopefully create services that can help you weather the coronavirus lockdown. Is that another question?
That's great, thank you. Yeah, there is. Is there the ability to see 2018 and 2019 data?
Not yet, because we don't have it yet. So
I can just come in on that one. We are in the process of collating 2018's data. We hope to be able to add that quite soon. The nature of the data collection, with this being a unique data set, is that most of the legwork falls on our friends over at MyCake to find, collate, and clean up the data. So it takes a little while to get it in there. But the data set is absolutely an active one. We're hoping 2018 will be online pretty soon, and then 2019 as soon as we can get it after that. But we will keep adding to it.
Thanks.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, our plan is to be able to let people swap between those so that they can choose to see 2018 or choose to see 2019's data.
Yeah, that's in the pipeline.
Super cool, super cool. Great. So I realise I'm getting very close to the sort of general Q&A time, so I'll just scroll down and show you the rest of this report. So salary, again, this shows us a breakdown. Again, we get to see input percentiles. So our salary costs are lower than the average, which is great. Building costs, our rent and rates is incredibly low. Our building costs are incredibly low, and our other costs are quite disproportionately high. So again, if we scroll up, it tells us that our average cost percentile is 27th. And so it will flag as red anything more than 20 percentile points away from that. So if our average on this area is 27th, then NIC, staff salaries, and rent and rates are, they're roughly within it, but building, very low, other costs, very high. So that's not just about benchmarking against the data set, which, as we said, is again, peacetime data set. This lets you benchmark against yourself to some degree. If you're looking at your organization and you're able to have a tool helpfully flag, not only are your other costs considerably higher than other organizations like yours, but they're higher than an organization making the amount of money you're making usually is. So then you could start interrogating, well, what are these other costs? Why are they so high? Why are they disproportionately higher than other organizations making the same amount of income as we are? And then we also have assets and liabilities. So this particular example is quite interesting in that they have incredibly low assets based upon incredibly high liabilities. But one of the points that comes through about the narrative, about being either an applicant or assessor and knowing this, is that the community business that provided this data was actually being supported by a larger, I think it was a charitable society of some nature. So the reason their building costs are so low is because they've been given the building on a peppercorn rent. And the reason that their assets are so low and their liabilities are so high is because they're technically operating under the supportive wing of a larger organization. So you can look at this and you can say, well, that's terrible. They've got nowhere near enough fixed and current assets to weather their current liabilities. But there's always a bit more truth behind the data. And that comes from really knowing the businesses that you're working with or you're representing to this. Do we have another question?
Sorry, I was on mute. How do you decide who is included, and is it an annual return process?
I can take that one if you like.
Yes, I was going to say, yeah.
So it's MyCake, our friends over at MyCake that do the data collection, and it's drawn from a variety of sources. So as Edward said, there's Companies House data in there, there is Charities Commission data in there, they have their own surveying as well. So it's quite a wide data pool. Obviously, community business is still a relatively young denomination for businesses, and there's a mixture of community businesses that we in MyCake identify as being community businesses. There are some that self-identify. So it's a mixture of the above. And in terms of the second question, which is how do we know the data is correct and is it audited? Yes, it is. One of the services that MyCake do is audit the data and kind of make sure that that it's good quality data going in. It's one of the reasons there's a bit of a lag in us getting data in year on year is it takes a little while to be completely sure that what we're putting in there and the insights we're drawing out are as absolutely reliable as they can be.
Great, thanks both. We're coming up to 10 minutes left of the webinar. So what we'll do now is we'll let Edward carry on, try and get through as much as possible, and then we'll just have 5 minutes for questions at the end. So any questions that come in now, we will answer them at the end. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. I mean, we're practically there anyway. The last thing is a wonderful little nestled button down here, download report. So as I mentioned, any of the data you put into this is not saved anywhere. You can play around with it. You can edit all of these fields. You can play around with the filter data and all that kind of stuff. So you can really get to grips with it. But then downloading the report takes everything that's on there currently, so including the data filters on the left and all of your data, and produces a Word document text report of all of this data, so that way, if you ever need access to this again, you don't come back to it. Let me just see if I can share this screen with you so you can see what it looks like. Oh dear, sharing screen with this is a bit of a challenge. That one, this one, that one. There we go. Hopefully you can see that. So it produces a summary of all of this data that you've just put into it, including which comparator group you're being compared against, and then all of the individual metrics, all of the ratios, and everything we've just shown you. So that if you want to have this to hand, you can save it to a text document and do what you want with it. So you don't have to go back to the tool and put all the data back in to have a look at it again. This includes everything that was on the report. It also includes all of the information about the ratios and what they mean, averages and percentiles, input breakdown, and then the highlighting. Unfortunately, it doesn't carry through. What we have is it says, so it actually just says orange or red. So that way, the flagging is carried through. It's not just quite as visual as it is on the other one, but no detail is spared. So what we mean with that is if you are using the dashboard tool and you're finding a report to be particularly useful, or as somebody mentioned, what if we wanted to compare the data of a specific other business to our own? You could put in their data, generate a report, put in your own data, generate a report, and then you could draw conclusions by looking at the parallels of the two without having to worry about this. But I will also say, if you end up using this, do download the report. It's a good idea to do it when you generate it, because if you leave this idle for about half an hour, it will refresh the page and forget all of your data. So having it just to hand to save you putting all of the fields in again is a good idea. But other than that, this is it. This is available. If you need any further support with it, you are absolutely welcome to get in touch with us. If you have feedback, ideas, critiques, things we've missed, things you'd really like to see, please do get in touch with us. We want this to be as useful as possible for as many people as possible. I think that's covered it for me. Really happy to answer questions. I don't know if Jake might like to add anything as well.
No, just happy to take questions. I noticed we've got one now about the level of usage so far. So usage has been modest so far. We've been live since the 16th of last month in this beta phase. And we've been having, variable traffic, some days sort of up to 20 or 30 users, some days obviously a bit less, and we've had a few bank holidays and things over the last few weeks. But we're hoping with webinars like this, and we're also offering this tool to any of the applicants for our trading income support schemes and some of our other COVID-19 support schemes. So we're hoping that we'll get a little bit more usage, and crucially, this being a public beta, we'll get some feedback so that we can make this as useful as possible.
And I've just seen another one now. Now I'm not worrying about scrolling around, I can see them. Does a sign up need to be approved to use the site? No, so anyone can use this. It's completely public facing. The idea being that putting the financial data into it, because it's not saved anywhere, you shouldn't have to worry about that at all. And worst case scenario, you can also just put financial data in it that should be available via Companies House or the Charity Commission anyway. But no, you don't need to get in touch with us. You don't need an account. It's literally just twine-together.com, benchmark, put in your data.
Okay, well, we're coming up to about 5 minutes left, and I think you've answered everyone's questions, and it must have been really clear because there aren't many questions, so that's fantastic. So we'll just leave it a couple more seconds for anyone to fire one in at the end. And all that remains for me to do is thanks so much to Edward, and thanks to Jake. That was really clear and helpful. And just to say, oh, we've got one. Will you offer live sessions to students?
I think we're currently in a position to offer live sessions to anyone. If you'd like a hand with it, yeah.
I was going to say, just as we come in, we by all means get in touch with us, and we're happy to offer a bit of training on the tool. We're happy to do sort of webinar and sessions like this to groups of students or other groups. This being a beta, and this being quite a big release for us, we're absolutely happy to provide whatever support people feel they'd need.
Well, I should ask them, what's the best way to get in touch with the team?
I don't know whether we want a Gmail or my personal Power to Change one, but my email is just edward.walden@powertochange.org.uk. I'm sure that we could possibly circulate that to participants afterwards in an email.
We can do that. You can also reach us at powertochangetwine@gmail.com as well.
Yeah.
Either of those, we'll absolutely get back to you and set something up.
I think, in fact, just our email address, or at least one of our contact email addresses, is probably just plastered all over our website. So if you've got as far as looking up Benchmark on our website, yeah. So if you go to our website to use Benchmark, if you scroll to the bottom of the website, there's an email address on there that will reach us, and there's also my phone number, which would reach this phone. So you're guaranteed to be able to get in touch with me at the very least.
Oh, thanks so much. We've had some really great comments on the session today, guys. So thanks so much. It's been really clear. And I will hope that everyone is well and stays safe. And I'll stop the recording now, and then the webinar will be available on the website. Thanks, everyone. And
Lucy,
oh,
I'm going to get in trouble. Sorry, I'm going to get in trouble and say, if anybody does go ahead and makes use of this, we would really, really appreciate the feedback. So we'd be interested in whether you've had sort of particular use out of it, whether you've found, whether found particular learnings out of it, anything like that. Feedback would be ideal. Thank you very much.
right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, guys. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.